today, it's important to also, there it is. If there's consent, we're hoping to record the conversation. Apologize for that. And furthermore, we're respecting our purpose for being here today. It's important to also acknowledge our Black ancestors who were taken from their homeland and brought here involuntarily to build this nation as we know it. We acknowledge those before us, those among us, and those who are yet to come. And as a foundation, we have a role in acknowledging our history and are responsible for the journey in healing, resourcing, and reparations. So thank you, everybody. I'm so excited for this conversation today. I want to introduce our speakers. First off is Kat with OutFront Minnesota. And Kat is Executive Director of OutFront Minnesota, Minnesota's largest LGBTQ plus advocacy organization. Kat joined the organization in 2022 after spending more than a decade in higher education work. Kat has long been passionate about LGBTQ plus issues and engaged in making change from the workplace to local communities. Kat lives in St. Paul, Minnesota with her partner and 2 kids. Thank you for joining us, Kat. And yes,
Thank you.
Thanks, Kat. Next is Mike, and Mike Phelan. If I'm saying your name right, I apologize. Say hello.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mike. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yep, go ahead, Mike.
No, I am the dad of an amazing trans kid. I am the board secretary of the Transformation Project Advocacy Network. After 15 years as a teacher, I recently opened a small independent book and game store here in Vermillion, South Dakota, where I live.
Great, thanks, Mike. And then we have Representative Leah Finke. Thank you so much for joining us. Feel free to introduce yourself.
Okay, hi. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm grateful to be here. My name is Leah Finke. I am a representative in District 66A in Minnesota. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the first trans person elected to the Minnesota legislature. And sorry, the screen keeps changing, so it keeps throwing me off a little bit. Yeah, before I was in the legislature, I worked for ACLU of Minnesota. I come from journalism and media production, documentary, and activism. I've been in activism most of my adult life. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here to talk about all the work that we have been able to achieve and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, everybody. So we wanted to share just a little bit about the foundation as well, just for folks who are new to the work. So a little bit about the foundation is that we have been investing in over $45 million across the state of Minnesota. And we have funded since 1983, funding transformative futures for women, girls, and gender-expansive people. And part of our work is that we do this through systems change. So research and listening, advocacy and policy change, cross-sector convening and partnerships, philanthropy and community investing, and strategic communications and narrative change. And the 4 impact areas I wanted to quickly touch base on the next slide is leadership and community power, economic justice, holistic well-being and reproductive justice, as well as safety are kind of the 4 impact areas that we do our work. I want to make sure that Kat also talks about OutFront, and who is one of our awesome and amazing grantee partner, who's been doing great work for a very long time. So a little bit about OutFront in the next slide is that OutFront was founded in 1987 to fight for LGBTQ plus justice and equity. Over the past 36 years, they have worked to ensure that the values of liberation and intersectional justice guide the work. And so I won't read the rest of it, but I'll pass it over to Kat to share more.
Yeah, thank you so much, and really deeply appreciative for the support that we've received from Women's Foundation of Minnesota. Our work is possible because of folks like the Women's Foundation stepping up and supporting and believing in the work that we do. OutFront really, a lot of different organizations approach LGBTQ equity and liberation work from different angles. OutFront really tries to look at this from a multi-tiered, multi-layered perspective. We'll talk a lot today about sort of policy landscape and where we're at just because of the folks that we have in this room. But OutFront also focuses on not just that state level policy, but local level conversations, engaging with folks in K through 12 schools to support youth and education, engaging on a one-on-one basis, supporting folks who have been the victims of violence and discrimination within our communities, and then really looking to not just change policy, but shift culture in a way that will create greater equity for all of the diverse members of our LGBTQ+ communities. So really appreciate the space to share more about our work and kind of ground ourselves in today's conversation, which is really talking about that intersection of justice and gender identity in a moment when this feels extraordinarily relevant to our national landscape. And so really glad to be joined by both Mike and Lee, who have both been great supporters and helpers in this work. So I think, kind of grounding us first, I just want to make the first piece of things here that I don't want to assume that we all know the terminology and language that we're using. So I'll just start with just a quick definitional piece and then kind of set the landscape a little bit and then kind of open a dialogue. Just as folks have questions, feel free to put them into the chat. We'll leave some time at the end as well for folks who do have additional questions beyond that. You've got some really great experts and perspectives in this room here, so really excited to see what we can bring. But for starters, just as kind of a definitional grounding, when we talk about LGBTQ+ community, we're talking about anybody who identifies under that big, broad rainbow of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, two-spirit, etc. Whole big broad landscape. But today, especially, I think we're going to be focused in on talking specifically about trans folks. And transgender, for those who are not familiar, means anybody who does not identify with the sex they were assigned at birth. So if you do identify with the sex you were assigned at birth, you are a cisgender individual. If you do not, you are a trans individual, part of a broad umbrella that can encompass a bunch of different terms and definitions and identities. LGBTQ identities and terminology are constantly changing, so don't feel like you have to be an expert to be engaged in this conversation, but really appreciate the time and space and attention to these important topics. So I think I'll start it off by just kind of setting the landscape a little bit, and I'll kick things over to Lee, kind of rewind us back to like November of 2022 and kind of where we were at as we were watching both what had happened in the 22 legislative session across this country and kind of teeing up conversations that were happening as we started to approach what can we do here in Minnesota to respond to this moment. So Lee, if you want to just kind of share, kind of how that moment felt for you and where you were coming into that conversation as you were, newly elected and thinking about like, what are we going to do in this space?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kat. And that's a really interesting question to think about starting at November of 2022, right? Because the story, as I understand what we've been doing and what we've been facing, it goes back to about 2015 and it sort of, the trajectory kind of climbs as trans visibility and representation grew and grew, starting with Danica Rome in Virginia and just moving forward. But then we kind of had this collapse, right? And this collapse that has continued, I would say, since 2020 in state legislatures, where we saw a lot of people trying to push anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ legislation even before 2020. But that's when we started to see these things really start passing and getting signed by governors. So by the time we reached 2022, right, I ran for office personally as a response to what was happening nationwide, the need for people who are trans and gender expansive to be in decision-making spaces. We started to see some of this anti-trans rhetoric in our legislature. Debates, nothing was going to pass. We had a Democratic governor, but it was still really gross and it was really alarming. And as we started to see things pass in other states, it became necessary for us to understand how we need to work in the state of Minnesota, in the capital. So I ran last year. Last year, 2022 was the most successful legislative session nationwide for anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ legislation until 2023. 2023 was an unbelievable success in the state of Minnesota, but it was a cataclysmic year for the rights of trans people. It really cannot be overstated how dystopian, how terrifying, and how really just like, you have to just call it successful, how successful the anti-trans movement has been in the United States. So when we arrived at election night, right, the day after election night in Minnesota in 2022, I did not expect us, just like everyone, I think, to have a trifecta. But when it did, it became very clear that we have an opportunity that we must seize immediately to protect communities that were vulnerable. And central to that would be the work of protecting the trans community. So it became my focus, my number one priority, to make sure that the trans refuge bill, or something like it, moved successfully through the legislature. It was not on the list of priority bills in terms of the Capitol leadership, but we made it that, right? OutFront started organizing all of the LGBTQ folks who were elected. We elected 11 people who were queer in that election, which is just tremendous to me, unbelievable still. And we started right from the beginning. This was the first thing. I had it ready. I was working with Jamie Becker-Finn, the Judiciary Chair. We had it written. We had it ready to introduce right from the start. And we started having hearings in it in January, because it's the one thing we knew we could do to help people who were in those states that we were seeing take away our rights, take away our healthcare rights. So, you know, that's kind of, I mean, that was a little bit broader than the question that you asked, Kat, but that's kind of where we were, right? Like, we are sitting at a time when the anti-trans movement is succeeding, I think, beyond their wildest dreams. And we are in Minnesota succeeding because of who we are as a state and what we have done. We are in a position to be on offense in the protection of trans and gender expansive people.
Yeah, I think that's a great summation. And I would say, you know, for me personally, I had been out to some close family and friends longer, but I came out publicly in 2015 in this moment of like, oh, we're coming off of the, you know, sort of Laverne Cox on the front cover of Time magazine transgender tipping point, right? Where like it felt like there was this hopeful shift in narrative that trans folks would be supported and affirmed and seen within society in a way that we had not been. We've always been a part of society, but that moment of public awakening felt like it was moving in a good direction. And then very quickly, from 2015 to now, has turned in a very complicated and messy and dangerous direction for many of us. And I think, you know, we're still grappling with that. Mike, I would love to hear from you. I know South Dakota has been in the thick of really challenging legislative landscape for the last couple of years. It's been one of the first legislators out of the gate, just both by timing and by how it's approached some of these issues. How has it felt for you, and how did the day after the election in 2022 feel for you all in South Dakota?
Yeah, South Dakota is a rough place to try and raise a trans kid. So we moved from Chicago to South Dakota summer 2020, and we have a young transgender kid who's under 10 years old. And I just want to step back one bit in case people are not familiar with what it means to provide gender-affirming care for a young kid. Because we hear from anti-trans people all the time that people are chopping off this or that, and they're making these permanent changes to kids, that parents are just doing this to their kids and things like that. Our kid came out to us as transgender at 4 years old. At 4 years old, they were able to say, "Dad, I have a girl heart," right? And this wasn't something that was completely out of the blue. There had been, you know, signs pointing, you know, in this direction for a little while. But when she came to us and she said, "Daddy, I have a girl heart," that's not something you say no to. That's not something you say, you know, "I know who you are better than you do." So we went to, and we talked to our doctors, we talked to pediatricians in Chicago. We talked to somebody at the kind of gender services clinic in Chicago who was at the time focused almost entirely on teenagers. And we said, okay, well, what does this mean for a young kid? And all that gender affirming care means for somebody at my daughter's age is to say, you're not crazy. That you know who you are and we can support you in being that person. There's no surgeries involved. There's no, all these scare tactics that are out there. We are looking down the line, in a couple of years to have puberty blockers, to have hormone therapy and things like that, which she will need, and that she can't get here in South Dakota now. We thought, hey, are we completely crazy to move to South Dakota with a trans person in our family? And the story that we tell is that in Chicago, in a kind of a big liberal city, we knew those resources were there on the day that we would need them. So we never felt like we had to be part of creating those resources. We didn't feel like it was necessary that we jump out and be intimately involved with the LGBTQ rights community. When we moved to South Dakota, we knew that if we wanted those resources, we have to be there to provide them for ourselves and for everybody else. So literally from day one in South Dakota, which is just about 3 years ago now, we've been kind of closely connected with some of the organizations that support trans kids in South Dakota. And because of that, we have such a better, tighter knit community of supportive trans folks and their families than we ever would have in a big city. I'll say on the flip side that it is tough to raise a trans person in South Dakota in 2023. Our legislative session here runs January to mid-March, and every year that we've been here, there have been multiple anti-trans bills introduced. Some of those we've fought off, some of those we have not. But to have state legislatures who every year look forward to attacking your kid is tough. So we kind of hold our breath to get through this legislative session every year. In 2022, we, in our small town, passed a school board policy allowing trans kids, allowing every kid in the district to use the bathroom that matches their gender identity. So we got it passed in our small town, which is great. We have a little progressive town here in Vermilion. We are in the kind of southeast corner of South Dakota, a few miles from Nebraska, a few miles from Iowa. But as soon as we passed that bill, the state legislature tried to pass, say, no, it's illegal now to have a gender affirming bathroom policy in your school. We were literally the only school district in the state that had such a thing, and now the state legislature is trying to come after us. We fought off that bill, but there was a anti-trans sports bill passed that year. And then this past year, right out of the gate, one of the very first bills was a bill denying gender affirming care in South Dakota. So my kid literally can't go to see the pediatrician and have them tell her that she's not crazy. That's what gender affirming care means for somebody her age. We can't do that. So it's so nice to be able to get care in Minnesota, to have the protections that are in this bill that not only can we get that care, but that Minnesota won't comply with South Dakota trying to come after us for getting our kid the medical attention that she needs. So thank you to Representative Finke, thank you to OutFront Minnesota, thank you to all of Minnesota for being that kind of light in the wilderness for us.
Yeah, we're proud to do the work. And I think, one of the things that I always ground in, one, Mike, really appreciate you sharing your story about your family, because I think for so many folks, this is new information for folks. There was just a poll put out by Gallup yesterday, and the sort of latest numbers are that only about a third of people in this country know a trans person individually, or at least openly know a trans person. We know there's a lot of trans folks who live in communities who are not out for good reasons. But I think, you know, the reminder is that for a lot of us, this is a new cultural narrative. Trans experiences, trans lives, how we navigate the complexity of gender identity, because for each of us, regardless of whether we identify as transgender or cisgender, gender is complex, and how we approach the world and how we approach identity in the world is complex. And so it brings up a lot of questions about, like, what does it mean to have spaces that are gendered? What does it mean to, you know, provide this type of care? And if you aren't familiar with it, it can be easy to fall into some of the cultural rhetoric and narratives that are really harmful. And I think one of the biggest and most important things that we've seen in sort of shifting that narrative here, at least within the state of Minnesota, and we've seen this both with gender identity, but also historically with the marriage equality movement here in the state, is just simply putting a human face on these stories. Marriage equality here in Minnesota, for those who don't recall, 10 years ago, we were facing a ballot measure that was seeking to ban same-sex marriages here within the state constitution. That ballot measure was defeated, and then ultimately Minnesota went on to legalize marriage equality in 2013. And that was in part largely due to community level conversations, not just about policy, not just about big moves towards those things, but about just having conversations with people about what it means to be, you know, in a same-sex relationship. And those conversations demystified the experience of LGBTQ people for many Minnesotans and opened the door to a more expansive and welcoming vision of what Minnesota can be. Lee, just kicking it back over to you again, what has it meant for you? You know, you're sort of in that strange position of both, you represent a district, but you also represent a state population in a very different way as a representative. How has that felt for you? Where has it felt good, tension-filled, complicated? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, being a trans person at the Capitol means being, you know, the trans person at the Capitol. And, you know, we do have a Representative Kozlowski, who is a non-binary two-spirit representative from Duluth. So there are two gender non-conforming folks that are there. But I've really, you know, part of what it means for me to be there is to be doing work on behalf of everybody who is trans, and not just in Minnesota, but I mean, I think about trans people all over the country, right? There's only 14, I think, trans and gender expansive people in the United States who are elected to state legislatures, and 0 above that. So, you know, I get a lot of messages. I think about my work in terms of two, especially my work in terms of trans advocacy, in two spaces. One is messages that I receive, right? The people who reach out to me, folks like Mike, parents of trans kids who are in other states and who are very concerned and scared for their kids. And I get a couple of these messages a week right now. Earlier in the legislative session, I was hearing probably 15 people a week were in my DMs and my, you know, emails who were saying, like, oh, I live in Missouri, I don't know what's going to happen. Like, how do I get to Minnesota? Should we come? Like, what's the future looking like? A lot of concern. And then that's true also of trans individuals. A lot of adult trans people from around the state, like you were saying, Kat, right? We exist everywhere in every community. So I got a lot of messages from trans people who live in, you know, rural towns in the state of Minnesota, who always have lived where they live, whether they are not out, whether they are passing, whatever language individuals want to use. But, you know, especially one person I've been corresponding with who lived in a small town, and you'll have to excuse me for not sharing it because, you know, there's probably only one trans person in that town. And I don't want anyone going looking for her. But she's been there for 15 years, right? And she's like, this is the first time in my life when I've been concerned that if someone finds out I'm trans, like, I'm in danger, you know? So there's this real sense of anxiety, I think is the right word, of people who are just like, I don't know about the future, right? We all worry about our kids. We all worry about our own futures. And if you are in the trans and gender expansive community, you're looking to the people who are in the public space to help you figure out how to make decisions, right? This is just a part of being a human, I think. And now that's me, right? I am the elected trans person. I am the person who gets random emails from people all across the country who are just like, I don't know what else to do. And that really guides a lot of the work that I do, because those folks need to understand that they have futures, right? Part of understanding what having a trans child or being an early transition person, one of the great questions that you ask is like, what does a trans future even look like? What do trans kids grow into, right? So I'm always thinking about how those kids are watching me, watching Zoe Zephyr in Montana or Maury Turner in Oklahoma or whatever. But we are modeling them a future where you can be trans and succeed. And then the other side of that work is that I need to be there despite what the consequences of being there are for me personally, which are hard and real. And doing the work that we did at the Capitol last year to protect trans people really brought a significant amount of anti-trans and anti-Leah Finke attacks. And it's something that I had never experienced before. And it was very jarring and very difficult and concerning, and has changed my life completely. And I recognize that it's a privilege to be elected, but I also recognize that it's a danger to be elected in these times, especially doing the work that we are doing. So being the representative for the trans community that I am when I'm at the Capitol, I always try to remember that first group of people, right, when I'm confronted by that second group of people, because they're always there. And they'll never go away and they'll never stop. Trolls will never stop. Anti-trans, right? Bigotry and prejudice don't go away. We'll never reach a point in the future when we no longer have racism, right? Like we would have reached that point. We will always have anti-Black racism in America. And we will also always have anti-trans people. We'll never overcome that, in my opinion, right? It's not incumbent upon us to get rid of that sentiment. It's incumbent upon us to create a society where we can flourish despite those people. And that's the work that like motivates me when I'm at the Capitol and I'm representing people who don't necessarily know what that society is going to look like.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. Growing up for me, I mean, I had no trans icons. I always joke with folks that the closest thing to a sort of trans icon or public figure that I had was Bugs Bunny, who I think was the most positive trans representation that I saw, just somebody who was like absolutely free to explore gender and presentation and expression in a way that was like unbound by all of these constraints and able to be like successful and happy and relaxed about life, right? But, there weren't trans representatives sitting in state houses when I was growing up as a kid. There weren't Laverne Coxes on TV and Elliot Pages. There weren't people in those positions of power or leadership within communities saying, this is a possibility for you. And Mike, I would love to hear for you. I know that connection of trans community and supportive families within, your Vermilion community has been really important. But what has that meant for your family and for your child?
It's meant the world for us. So South Dakota as a state is a rough place to be as a trans person. But so much of our day-to-day life is completely, we don't care what they're doing in Pierre, right? I care what the coffee shop on the corner is doing. I care what my neighbor at the movie theater is doing. And so it is the case that we have, a regularly scheduled trans rights rally that on our town square in the middle of February every year, because we know there's going to be anti-trans legislation. But I also know that on the 3-block walk to get to the town square, I pass 5 businesses with pride flags in the window. We see so many people who are our neighbors, our friends, and then people that we don't know in our community who come out and maybe they vaguely know a trans person, maybe they don't know that they know a trans person, right? The numbers are such that if you know a redheaded person, you probably know a trans person, right? The percentages are probably roughly equal. And So something that Lee was just talking about having trans icons, about having trans futures visible, is something that we've kind of worked with our daughter and other trans kids in town on a regular basis to show what things are possible. Vermilion is a college town. The University of South Dakota is here, that has a fantastic, very active GSA group. And so individuals from that group are regularly in attendance at community events that are not, necessarily pride events, that are not trans rights rallies, that are, trivia at the local restaurant. But to say, hey, there's that person, they are queer, they are trans, they're happy to talk to you about what that experience is like. And then reaching out to other leaders around the country. We happened to take a family trip to Delaware a little while ago, and met with Sarah McBride, who's a out trans state legislator, their state senator in Delaware. And we thought, hey, could we, introduce our kid to you for 5 minutes, just so that she can see that there is, there are trans people succeeding and doing amazing things. And Senator McBride sat down with us for an hour at, a local coffee shop in her district, and let my daughter tell her all about whatever pop star she was into that particular week, and all of these things. And so we're at a place, and I think the two are related, that Representative Finke was talking about, that because trans people started to be kind of more accepted and more visible, that's what brought this pushback from the kind of reactionary elements in society of, no, go away. Now I'm having to see trans people in public, and that's making me angry. I think those two things so often go hand in hand, right? We start to make a little progress in this social area, and that blows back. But the key thing is to not stop, right? I don't think I have to convince anybody on this call that we're not going to stop existing as human beings. The LGBTQ community, the trans community, isn't going to go backwards. We just have to create safe spaces and create support networks to make those next steps possible for everybody. We have, I have a small bookstore here that we opened last year, a year and a half ago, that has kind of maybe become a little bit of a hub for LGBT community in town. But where people can come and say, okay, it is safe to talk about this here. I know I'm going to run into somebody who I can talk to about such and such issue, or that I can just, go have coffee with, and know that that we have a safe community. And looking at some of the work and some of the kind of visibility work that's out there, we got to host recently a movie screening with Frankie Gonzalez Wolf, who was the first out trans person to run for public office in Texas. She ran for the San Antonio City Council recently, and made a documentary about that. And talked in the conversation we had with her about having and being trans elders for the next generation of kids. And my 7-year-old came up afterwards like, oh yeah, here's a list of 3 or 4 people that I know around the state who I look up to in that way. And again, fabulous people that we never would have met had we not been out there doing the work.
Yeah, I always like to tell people, more than anything else, people focus on the policy, but at the end of the day, what I like to say is that we're in the business of cultivating hope and space for people. And those are the two most important things. LGBTQ community has been here forever, and OutFront's been organizing for the last 35 years to try and give our community the power and the energy and that, organizing point for moving things forward. And here in Minnesota, we've been really fortunate to both have wins in terms of policy over those 3.5 decades of work, but also wins in terms of culture change. And I think one of the big takeaways that I have from all of this work, and it, sort of goes back to the old Paul Wellstone quote is like, we all do better when we all do better, but especially when you focus on the folks who are most marginalized by policies, by systemic oppression, by all of these challenges, you're able to start unpacking and breaking apart the systems and the structures that have held us all down. When I think about what it means to lift up queer and trans people of color, when I think about what it means to ensure that youth have access both to healthcare, but also to bright futures where they can be their full selves, like those are the building blocks to a world in which everybody can thrive, in which everybody has access to equity and education, in which everybody has access to seeing whatever career trajectory and life trajectory that they want to have, in which everybody has that space to say, I can see myself in a future in this world, in this community, in this space. And I can see leaders who look like me. I can see community members who support me for who I am. And I can live my life without that sense of guarded caution and concern about who I'm going to be and how's that going to show up in this world. And I think, you know, when we do this work, and I know Lee and I have talked a lot about sort of the different layers to it, right? It's not just about one particular bill. The trans refuge bill in some ways was just a response to our current moment, something that we needed to do. But there are so many other layers of policy and culture that we're working on shifting to try and get us all to a place where not just the trans community, but all communities within Minnesota are able to really fully enjoy the promise of what our state is and what our society promises to us. We've got a couple minutes left. I want to give some time for questions that folks might have. So whether it's to me or to either of our two panelists here who are joining me, would welcome any questions you have, whether it's about Minnesota's legislation, trans issues in general, the current state, where we go from here. Open it up for any asks you might have.
Thanks, Kat. I'll get started. I know that, thank you so much for both of your and everyone's stories so far. And I'm wondering if you can share with folks, you know, I dropped in some data and what that shows. And I would love for you to share a little bit more about what are some of those stories that, you know, that means for you, and how do the policies, you know, make those changes better for you in terms of your loved ones. And you know, and I'm hearing, you know, kind of this, not only just why this is important for Minnesota, but our neighbors in South Dakota, and really as a safe haven state. What does that all mean? Yeah, Mike.
I'm happy to answer, Lee, or Mike.
Sure, I can, you know, from our point of view here as a neighbor, we were already getting care in Minneapolis for our daughter. There were, as of 6 months ago, maybe 3 doctors in the state of South Dakota providing gender affirming care, and now they can't do that. So we have to go to Minneapolis now. So just for a doctor's appointment, it's a 5-hour one-way drive for us, and we live in the close part of South Dakota. The folks that are in the center of the state or West River, double or triple that for some people. And that's if you have access to transportation that can get you there, time off work, the financial aspect of, making a trip like that just to go see a doctor is substantial. We have friends here in town who need to go down to Kansas City to get gender affirming care, and they don't know, they've got an appointment scheduled in a couple of weeks, and they don't know if it will be legal to attend that appointment. We know that one of our kind of most rabidly anti-trans state legislators here in South Dakota is already planning a travel ban law bill for next year to make it illegal for us to leave the state to get care. So the fact that Minnesota has a trans refuge law is hugely important to us. It just, I mean, the kind of weight it takes off of our shoulders to know that our medical records will be protected, that Minnesota won't comply with subpoenas to try and penalize us for accessing care there from the wonderful medical team that we've worked with at Minnesota Children's. And the half of the bill that's kind of parent and custody related, thankfully our family hasn't, both my partner and I are very supportive, but we do know families that where one parent supports the kid and the other does not, and they worry every day of what will happen. Will the state take away my kid? Will I lose custody because I'm trying to provide medically appropriate care for my children? And knowing that Minnesota is out there helping is hugely important to us. Every family that I know with a trans kid in South Dakota and in many states around the country, every family that I know has a plan in the back of our mind all the time of when will it get bad enough that we have to bolt? When do we abandon our community, our business, and move to an affirming state? And we're thinking about that all the time. So knowing that there is a safe place to be so close is just hugely, I can't stress how important that is to us and what it does for our peace of mind. So thank you all.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I just want to add for folks on the call that it's worth, we just heard what Mike was saying, right? But it's worth sitting with it for a second. People are losing their families, right? The stakes of the conversation that we're having there are parents in other states in the United States who are under investigation for affirming their child's identity. People are fleeing. People are I met 6 families or individuals from Texas or Georgia in the last 2 weeks who have now moved to Minnesota because they aren't going to risk anything, right? And that takes means. We said at the Capitol, right, because we're talking about the trans refuge bill, and the trans refuge bill is absolutely essential. The most important piece of legislation I think we could have passed for our community nationwide. But we also talked about how we have the queer agenda. The queer lawmaking agenda at the Minnesota Capitol is housing, substance use disorder policy, ending homelessness, making sure that people are getting paid a fair wage, making sure that people have what they need to build a future. The worst thing we could possibly do, in my opinion, is ask people to move to Minnesota to get health care and then not provide them with health insurance, not provide them with jobs so they can sustain themselves. We need to make sure that we are doing all that we can to let the people who need help succeed. And that's not just protecting them from investigation in other states, although that's just absolutely devastating and important. We need to make sure that when they get here, their needs are met. They have a place to live and a job. It's just, sometimes I think we hear these things. We hear, oh, am I going to lose custody of my kid? We hear is there going to be a lawsuit? But every individual family facing that is a story about a person who's facing life-changing decisions and terrifying decisions. So I just want to make sure we're hearing what that really means for people.
Yeah, and I'll just dovetail just to quickly close that one. I know we have a couple more questions, but yeah, dig into that data that was dropped into the chat, because that's a really good snapshot for folks of the landscape here in Minnesota. The trans refuge bill addresses a thing that's happening to us nationwide, but here in Minnesota, there's work to do on all of these levels in all sorts of community spaces that is ongoing, that we've been engaged in for years, that lots of folks have been engaged in for years. But we have a lot of work to do here, even as we celebrate important and necessary and critical wins. And it's that work that ultimately will create a Minnesota that is truly equitable and inclusive for everybody. It's not just passing one bill or one set of legislation. It's that broader picture of how do we address holistically the challenges affecting our lives, and specifically the folks who are most marginalized. So we've got a quick question here from Brew Davis asking about managing and encouraging power building between cis women and the trans community, and encouraging cis allies to get loud, especially around the inclusion of trans women. So I don't know, Leah, I know both you and I have navigated a lot of really fantastic cis allies in this work, who have stood up and with and for us in different spaces. I think for me, you know, I know that there is this sense of tension created by some of the rhetoric around this, that like, you know, trans women are like taking over, you know, changing women's spaces. But at the end of the day, like, I don't see that as an actual, I see that as an artificial sense of competition. I don't think that trans women are taking anything away from cis women. I think what we're doing is, one, simply occupying space that we've always occupied as being part of this broader and bigger definition of what women and what gender expansive folks can be within society. And that has shifted. If you look across cultures, if you look across history, there are many different iterations of this. So, you know, we are just one more evolution in a broad human cultural understanding of what it means to explore and expand our ideas of gender. But I think the other piece too is that there is so much strength in standing up for one another's rights. Not to preview too much, but we'll have a conversation around reproductive freedom and you know, LGBTQ intersections in our next conversation with Senator Erin May Quaid, amongst other folks. And the overlaps in terms of talking about our bodily autonomy, about our freedoms, about our decision-making, about our ability to be our full selves, just they're identical, and the opposition to these issues is the same sets of people showing up for the same things. It's the same people showing up against, you know, anti-racism work. It's the same people showing up to take away reproductive freedom. It's the same people taking away gender-affirming care. And if we talk about them holistically and together, we have the power of standing with a broad and diverse group of folks who say, no, I reject that notion of society, and I want to welcome an inclusive vision of what we can have.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, I think that the coalitional work is what makes this like it's true that there are issues around inclusivity of trans people and trans women and femmes, especially around certain communities. That's true. But the people who are in the fight, they understand the Venn diagram of people who oppose abortion and want to take away the rights of women, and people who oppose trans rights and want to take away the rights of all LGBTQ people. That's just the circle. Those are the same people. And we know when we're in the work that those people are going to have our backs, and they know that we have their backs. The Women Winning Luncheon was yesterday, right? And it's just like, it's just the same groups of people doing the same work. But it does take work, right? I mean, we do have to make sure that we are in conversation and that we are understanding and respectful, just like other folks do as well, right? We don't make assumptions. I don't make assumptions walking into any room that the people around me are inclusive and safe and interested in hearing what I have to say. I make sure that that's true before I invest myself personally. And that's part of the work too. But yeah, I mean, exactly what Kat said.
That's such a great, beautiful response. Thank you both. And, you know, I know our liberation is shared in many ways. And one of the things I wanted to respond to, Brew, too, thank you for your question, is that part of what our work here too at the Women's Foundation is, as we were evolving, we're celebrating 40 years this year, and realizing what does it mean to include gender expansiveness. And I love what I think you tweeted this at some point, Leah, about, you know, the definition of women should be strong and expansive enough to include everybody, and especially the trans community. And I think that's a really lovely way of reminding folks that as well. And I want to pass it to Maggie. You had your hand up.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. This has been such a lovely conversation. So first of all, just on what you were all talking about, like, I could not agree more. I have a trans sibling, and I am a cisgendered straight woman. And I mean, the ways in which I have been blessed to learn and witness their transition over many years now, it's made me a better person. It's made me feel safer. And so in my experience, there's no competition. It's to what you were saying, Kat, like, there's so much overlap, and it's really amazing when you take ego and scarcity mentality out of the way, like what we can accomplish. But from my background is in partnerships, really. I'm in the reproductive health space, and just thinking about like what have been some of the really effective ways that you strategized around coalition building, and however you want to answer that, please do. But I'm kind of thinking about like maybe some surprising partnerships that have come out in Minnesota, and some strategies you've implemented to maintain those and really make sure long-term that these policies can build on one another and we can continue to be a safe haven state.
Yeah, I think, from OutFront, we've been part of a number of coalitions over a number of years in a number of different spaces, including the reproductive space, and really grateful to have coalition spaces here within Minnesota that are welcoming of LGBTQ voices, because that has not always traditionally been the space in reproductive freedom or in any number of other movement spaces. I think, for me, one of the most joyful sort of coalition surprises this year was like sitting down with the Girl Scouts of Minnesota on our conversion therapy ban that we also passed here in the state. And like this sense of like, Girl Scouts doesn't naturally seem like a partner in that sort of like deeply political space, but grounding it in the space of like, what does it mean to create safe and thriving communities for all of our youth, and rejecting conversion therapy as just like utterly unmedical, things that are going to harm children. Like that's a shared value that we can all get behind. And when we center it around that set of values-based assumptions of like, we all want children to thrive, we want children to have access to good, healthy, evidence-based medical care, like suddenly we open the door to all of these coalition partnerships that aren't about, even necessarily like, die hard like LGBTQ rights support, but it's about saying like, hey, this is actually a value we share together. And I think, we saw that at the Capitol as well, as folks stood up for a number of the different bills and pieces of legislation that we worked on. Like we were showing up for one another in different spaces that might not have on the outside felt like natural partnerships, but we're about thinking about like that depth of community experience and engagement in a very different way than I think some places have approached it. And I think when you create coalitions that are deep and rich and complicated, like you're able to move that conversation forward because you actually have the people at the table who need to be there, instead of just assuming that you can make decisions based on what you know about a set of communities. And that means complicated conversations. I've sat in plenty of coalition calls where we don't all agree on everything, but it also means like being in dialogue in a way that's authentic and really engaging with people wherever they're at on whatever conversation topic you're on.
Yeah, and I mean, I will just add to that I think, one of the spaces, so I'm in the Capitol, right? I come from movement organizing and nonprofit work, and I'm in the Capitol. And at the Capitol, we have conversations with different communities to build a coalition to support a policy, right? So we had a policy, the Queer Caucus, I'm the chair of the Queer Caucus at the Capitol, and we had a priority bill to create gender-inclusive facilities in every school, right? Representative Kozlowski carried this bill, and it was, how do we make sure that every person in every school has a bathroom that feels safe, a place to change their clothes if they need to, right? And one of the ways that we were able to move that bill very successfully and very swiftly was we understood that trans people are not the only people who need that, right? It's this obvious that like there are other communities and there are just other kids who probably just want to use the single stall restroom. The ADA compliance is a huge problem in a lot of our schools, right? So we worked with our disability advocates, right? Working with the disability community is a huge priority for me, and everything that we're doing to help our neighbors with disabilities is going to help our trans community, and that all is going to help all the other students, right? Liberation flows outwards, all liberation flows outwards. So we need to make sure that we're doing this sort of policy making, strategic allyship situation that we're doing at the Capitol, like that also, we need to be doing that every day statewide all year, right? So coalition work, like I started a nonprofit this year to do that work outside of the Capitol because I saw a window where I thought, okay, I don't know anybody who's doing this work. I'm going to jump in there. We're going to create something. We're going to make sure we're doing this coalitional work with specifically BIPOC, LGBTQ folks in the Twin Cities. And we're going to build spaces, and we're just got to keep having those. And then I want that work that I'm doing in and out of the Capitol. It's all one job in my mind, right? And I do that job in coalition with Pat every day, regardless of whether it's in the Capitol or out of the Capitol. And that job is being done also with the Black trans leaders who I've gotten to know in Minneapolis, regardless of where I am, and the disability community. Those are sort of networks that I think are just essential to all of the decisions that are being made. And when you do that, when you are conscientious of that, not afterwards, but beforehand, you build trust. And when you build trust with people, then you can continue to build policy that's going to work for them. And they can trust that you're going to do that. And I guess coming back to the question from Brew a little bit, there is a real trust gap, right, that exists in the trans community, especially the BIPOC trans community, where folks are saying, okay, well, we don't feel like we have been listened to. We don't feel like we have been lifted up by a lot of the organizations that are trying to now solve our problems. So it goes both ways, and it's a matter of building trust and building honestly together towards something that like everybody's going to benefit from, because everyone benefits. Everybody benefits from having healthcare equity. I mean, it's like trans people need that right now, but everybody needs that.
Yeah, I'll just touch in and say, building off of what you have both just said, this is something that's going to make, that does make the world better for everybody in so many ways. We've had the same issue you were talking about with school bathrooms at a statewide level in Minnesota, just here in our school district that has one high school, right? And all of these issues are local issues too, right? We get focused, I think, a lot on what is my state government doing? What is my federal government doing? What is your neighbor doing? What can you do in your school district? What can you do in your block, in your local library, to help increase visibility? And among that, especially as a cisgender ally doing some of this work, it's incumbent upon us, because we have a little bit of privilege in terms of safety, in terms of financial ways, in many ways, to say, okay, who can I invite into the conversation, right? Who's at the level of, okay, I'm just generally supportive, but if you'd asked me to do more, I would do more, right? Who's ready to say, okay, well, I've been kind of wishy-washy on trans issues in the past, but if I heard one more thing, if I talked to a family member of a trans person, and really heard the actual story and not the story that Fox News is telling, right? So how can we invite more people in to be allies with us? One thing from the South Dakota point of view, there are 105 seats in the South Dakota state legislature. I think there's 11 Democrats currently. We can't wait until we have a majority of progressive politicians in our state. That's not going to get us done for us, right? Pipe dream of maybe we'll win 60 more elections this year. No, we've got to say, okay, who's in power now, and where can we make progress? We're not going to jump to being the most progressive state in the country in one swoop, but where can we make things better at the margin? And we do. The trans healthcare bill this year didn't go very well for us, but over the past 5 years, we've had a lot of Republicans vote in ways that help the trans community, and maybe they wouldn't frame it that way. Maybe they, to sell it to themselves or to sell it to their constituencies, talk about personal freedom. Maybe they talk about, talk about the issue from a variety of different perspectives. But in so many ways, there are, a lot of people who are waiting to be asked to take a next step, or who would do it if they talk to a family member of a trans person, talk to the, somebody, a best friend of a trans person, something like that. And it's incumbent upon those of us that have a little bit more privilege in terms of safety, in terms of financial ability to do so, to say, because, like I said before, we all have a plan of where we're going to run to, but there's a million people in South Dakota that don't have the opportunity to run and, stand up for the people that need standing up for.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for all of the wonderful perspectives so far. So I want to move us to how to get involved in resources. As we mentioned, follow the leadership of LGBTQ+ movement leaders, support the work of groups and organizations doing the work to support impacted families like Mike and others. Learn, gather, and be in community, and have conversations in your local community as well. On the next slide, we have some resources for folks, and we'll email this to everyone after the conversation as well. So yes, follow OutFront. There's Transformation Project. Oh, go back one more. There's a couple others here as well. And there's so many things happening for Pride Month. So please check them out. Bring your loved ones, be in community, be in conversation. And of course, continue to tell the stories that we need to share and amplify. And finally, you can get in touch with Kat or either me in the next slide. And also our next conversation coming up on inclusive reproductive justice. What does that mean? How does that impact everybody from not only women and girls, but men and boys and our trans community, LGBTQ+, right? So that will happen on June 27th. Please register at the link there. And yes, please join Kat and others. And we hope to see everyone in person and to enjoy the sunshine. I want to leave with one last thing as well. And yes, Lee and Mike, if you have any other resources, feel free to drop it in. Oh, there we go. queerequityinstitute.org. Amazing. And we'll leave with just, gratitude for everybody for joining us so far. Thank you for kicking off our Pride Month at Women's Foundation with such a critical, important conversation. And thank you for all of your wonderful work. And I'll leave with just a brief poem that I want to share, if you'll indulge me for a moment. This poem is called "The Moon is Trans," and this is by a poet named Joshua Jennifer Espinosa. So the moon is trans. From this moment forward, the moon is trans. You don't get to write about the moon anymore unless you respect that. You don't get to talk to the moon anymore unless you use her correct pronoun. You don't get to send men to the moon unless their job is to bow down before her and apologize for the sins of the earth. She's waiting for you, pulling at you softly, telling you to shut up already, please. Scientists theorize the moon was once a part of the earth that broke off when another planet struck it. Eve came from Adam's rib, etc. Do you believe in the power of not listening to the inside of your own head? I believe in the power of you not listening to the inside of your own head. This is all upside down. We should be talking about the ways that the blood is similar to the part of the outer space between the earth and the moon, but we're busy drawing it instead. The moon is often described as dead, though she is very much alive. The moon has not known the feeling of not wanting to be dead for any extended period of time in all of her existence, but she is not delicate and she is not weak. She is constantly moving away from you the only way she can. She never turns her face from you because of what you might do. She will outlive everything you know. So with that, happy Pride, everyone, and we'll see you at the next conversation. Thanks, folks.